Hello guys, I'm going to create a series of 2, maybe 3 videos in which I'm going to give you an introduction to databases so you can use it as a foundation as you work on how to manipulate your data for your IEA. Today we're going to start with the first one. In this first one, I'm basically going to answer the question about what is a database and how to create our own ERD, which stands for Entity Relationship Diagram. Okay, so let's start with databases. Okay, before I go in detail about databases, I want to make this clarification that I have made to some of you already, or to most of you already individually, and it relates to why do we need this. Okay, so please remember that for your IEA, you will most likely, almost for sure, you will need to have some sort of persistent data. So I'm going to repeat what I meant by when I talk about persistent data. So far, the programs that we have worked on in class are programs that when you close them, you lose all data, right? Every time you open your program, the program starts anew. This is definitely not practical for any of your clients. It will be a very rare case, the one in which you have a client that can just have the program start anew every time you run it, right? So most likely you're gonna have to have some sort of persistent data, okay? There are basically 2 things in your IEA that you for sure are going to need to have and that are not part of the curriculum. The first one is graphical user interface. It's not part of our curriculum, but I have given you some sort of an introduction, and I want to give you an introduction because you are definitely going to need to have some sort of graphical user interface in your IEAs. And the second one is this one, data, management of persistent data, okay? Not part of the curriculum, but you're definitely going to need to have some sort of persistent data, okay? Having a relational database with your software, with your program, is one way to collect persistent data or to hold persistent data in your program, but it's definitely and most certainly not the only one, okay? So my warning here is the fact that I'm making this video about relational databases does not imply or does not mean that you must have one, okay? This is very dependent on your technology stack, dependent on the language that you're using, and most importantly, dependent on the problem that you're actually solving, okay? This is just one out of the many ways. So how do you find out if you need one or not, right? So once you start collecting information and working, or as you're working on your design, hopefully right now that you're working on your criteria B, you're going to start doing things like your data dictionary, which is a must, right? You start making a list of all of the pieces of data that you're going to collect either during the execution of your program or persistently, right? Something you want to keep. And you're going to make a list of all of those pieces of data, right? That's based on your problem. That's based on the information that you have gathered from your client. You're also going to do some data flow diagrams, right? So you're going to determine what are the processes that are going to manipulate data and how is that data in your program going to flow from one process to the other. As you do those 2 things, your data dictionary and your data flow diagrams, you are going to be able to realize whether you need to have that persistent data. First of all, if you are actually going to need to have some persistent data in your program. And second, if that it's a lot of data that needs to be organized in a certain way, or if it's just a couple of things that you need to hold and read and write on every time that you run your program, okay? So, for example, if the information that you need is something minimal, something that can be held, for example, on a file, then you maybe don't need a database. Maybe you can work with files instead of a database and just read and write over one file or a series of files. That's one possibility, right? Maybe you're doing an app, right? A mobile app. So maybe you don't need to have a full database because the information that you hold it is not that much. It's just like user, I don't know, settings, right? That can be saved within some of the structures that the programming languages that exist for web apps actually have available for you to store that information on the devices, okay? So it's your responsibility to do a little bit of that research depending on your language, and you, particularly in your language first, right? What are the possibilities for persistent data in my language and in my technology stack, and which one is more suited for my client needs? In general, I will say if there's a lot of data that is interconnected, most likely you might need to use a database instead of a file or just the local storage in the device that the user is going to be working with, okay? So I hope that's a little bit helpful. Like I said, since databases might be one of the most common options, that's what I wanted to give you guys an introduction on those. So now let's talk about databases. Okay, so what is a database? First of all, is simply a set of data that is stored electronically in a computer and following a certain level of organization. Okay. Like I mentioned, normally you're gonna have to have that data that persists or that still exists even after you close the program and open it up again. For example, imagine that every time that you open PowerSchool, none of your information will be there. Imagine that you will have to create all of the students every time that you go into PowerSchool. Imagine that you will have to add all of the grades every time you open PowerSchool. Definitely useless, right? So the information is there every time you open, and it's complex information, a lot of information that is interconnected, right? I have students, I have classes, I have grades, I have many, many pieces of information. Definitely that's the kind of a scenario in which a database is needed, okay? With a database, you have the ability to not only store information, but also to query that data or to search and filter data efficiently. That's the main characteristic of a database, okay? Normally, your data will become a file or a series of files. But in order for you to be able to create that database and to manipulate that database, to manage that database, you use something that you're gonna find online as you do your research that is known as a DBMS, or a database management system. This is basically a piece of software that exists to create, manipulate your database or your data, create your database, right? So here I have some of the ones that are well known, okay? In a second video of this series, I'm gonna show you how to use NetBeans as your DBMS as well, okay? So you need to have some sort of server that will help you to run your database and to manipulate your database. For those of you that are working on web, you might use something different, okay? So I'm gonna give you an intro on NetBeans. You're gonna have to do your own research if you're doing something else. Additional to that, in order to manipulate your database, or the way that we manipulate databases is that we use a special language, not so much a programming language, but a special language that we use that is only used for databases. This language is called SQL, stands for Structured Query Language, okay? And it's a language that is used to create, access, filter, organize the information that you have in the database. It's very basic, very easy to learn. I'm going to give you some basics of it as well in the following. Once we create our database on NetBeans, I'll show you how to do a couple of statements so you can search for information using SQL and create your tables using SQL. But if you want to learn a little bit more, on CodeHS, I've added a new module. So if you look at all of the modules that we have been following OOP up to OOP 5, down below, there's a new module for SQL that is completely optional. Just if you want to learn more about SQL, the module is right there with slides, exercises, etc. Okay. I might place the link to that. Let me see. So I placed the link to the SQL module on CodeHS right here in case you want to follow it. There's many other tutorials that you can follow. If you search it up online, for sure, you're going to find many different options for you to learn SQL. And like I said, it's very, very simple language for you to find information on the database, okay? So moving on. Within the world of databases, there's also many types of different databases that you can create. The one that I'm going to concentrate on today is the relational databases. Again, because it's one of the most common ones that you want to use, okay? A relational database is a database that is the same as a collection of data, but it's what differentiated from other databases is the interrelations that exist between the pieces of information in the database. So instead of having everything in one file, it's separated into what is known as entities, and those entities are interrelated. We're going to learn what that means in a second, okay? So what are the characteristics of these relational databases? The information is stored in tables, not table, but different tables. Imagine like different spreadsheets, right? Each table will follow some very strict rules as to the structure of the table, and those tables can be interconnected or related, have relationships among them, okay? So what are some of the basic components of a relational database? So I have here a little tiny example. This is a database of 2 tables, right? And this is one of the tables. So this is a graphical representation of the table. This is the actual table with data on it, okay? So here is some terminology that you may need to understand in order to work with relational databases. An entity. So an entity is defined as an object of interest in the particular system that you're developing. So for the organization, for the software that you're developing, there might be certain objects of interests or certain things that your organization wants to keep track of. Those are entities, and we are going to learn how to identify them. In this particular example, for example, I have 2 entities, the customer entity and the account entity, okay? The attributes are each one of the characteristics that identify an entity, that differentiate each one of the different versions of an entity. For example, here I have the attributes for the customer. A customer will have a customer number, a name, and an address, and those are the attributes of my entity customer. And these are the attributes of my entity account. You will also hear about tables, and a table, like I mentioned, is something like this, which is basically a 2-dimensional representation of an entity. So I take the entity and I start creating records of each one of those customers on a table, very much like a spreadsheet, right? And that's what a table is within a database, okay? On a table, we're gonna have table columns and we're gonna have table rows. The columns will represent those attributes that we mentioned before. So each one of the columns on your table are going to be each one of the attributes on your entity. And each one of the table rows represents what is known as a record or a instance of that entity. So for example, this row represents one of the customers, the customer Peter Jones, that it's identified with this customer number and has this following address, okay? We also have a couple of other pieces of terminology that we're going to use. The first one is the primary key, okay? The primary key is one attribute or one column on your entity or table that identifies your instance, okay? These primary keys cannot ever be empty. That you can have a record that has no name, for example, but you cannot ever have a record that has no primary key. These are used to identify that record, so they need to be there and they need to be unique. You cannot have repeated codes, because then if I have the same code for 2 students or for 2 customers, for example, in this case, then that will create conflicts, right? So this is a unique value that helps me to identify each one of those instances or each one of those rows or each one of those particular records for that table, okay? We also have something that is called a foreign key. I'm going to explain a little bit more about that later on. But basically, a foreign key is a field or an attribute that you're going to add to a table to relate it to another table, that it might be a primary key on another table, but it's not going to be a primary key on your table. That's a little bit confusing. Don't worry, I'll explain a little bit better once we talk about relationships later on. Okay, and what are relationships? Relationships are very similar to what we do with objects, guys. A relationship is basically the connection that is going to exist between these tables, right? So definitely, let's say this is, for example, for a bank, right? A customer will have accounts, maybe more than one, right? Might have 1 or more accounts, right? An account can belong to 1 customer, maybe more, but in this case, it says that only 1. I'll explain how these relationships are also created, okay? So here's a little bit more of a description. What an entity is. It's an abstract or concrete thing that exists and is distinguishable that we need to collect information about. Okay, it may be a physical thing or it may be a conceptual thing. Attributes are the properties that describe those entities. And it will become part of the data that we store in the database. And like I mentioned, the relationship is the association or the connection between 2 entities, okay? Here also for you to be able to differentiate an entity type or an entity, for example, in this case refers to the employees in general, whilst an instance or a record refers to one of those occurrences of that entity, right? Similar to the concept of class and object. You can see that relationship right there, okay? Okay, so that's theory. Let's go into the practice, okay? So how do we design our own database? So I put together, I think that in these 6 steps, you will be able to get a database that is working with your program, okay? So the first step will be to just start designing your database. And to start designing your database, the first thing that you need to do is to identify your entities, your attributes, and your relationships. Okay, so we're gonna go in detail as to how to do that. After that, you're gonna have to create an ERD, and then you will be done for your criteria B part, right? After you have your ERD, you're gonna be able to translate that ERD into actual SQL instructions. So I'm gonna show you how to do that as well. Once you have those SQL instructions, you can also create your database either using your SQL or using your SQL instructions or using a database management system like I mentioned before. Then you're gonna have to have your code and your programming language, and you need to have a connection between your code and your database. So you're gonna need to connect those two together. I'll show you how to do that in NetBeans. And then you're gonna have to write or be able to write at least basic SQL queries is what they're called, to manipulate or to inquire about information on that database, okay? So today we're going to talk about these 2, and then we're gonna do the next ones in another second version of this video, okay? So let's start with identifying entities, attributes, and relationships, okay? So in order to identify these 3, there's a process that you can follow, very simple process. And you guys have some information that will help you to do that right now. That information is your criteria A. In your criteria A, you already describe your problem in detail, and you also have a set of criteria for success that determines what is the program or your application is going to do, okay? So the best way to go about finding what are the entities in my program, in my software, is by looking for nouns. I'm talking about English here, grammar, nouns and collective nouns. So you're just simply going to do this little exercise. You're gonna go over your criteria A, and you're gonna go and highlight all of the nouns and all of the collective nouns that you added in that description, okay? To show you as an example, I have here this problem description, right? And most importantly here is the criteria for success, or the series of things that this program is supposed to do. So as you can see, the nouns and general collective nouns are already highlighted here. So, and this highlighting of these nouns, I didn't put the repeated ones, like I didn't put customer here because it was already there, right? Product is already there, orders is already there. So all of those are highlighted, right? So this gives me an initial potential list of attributes. Each one of those could potentially become an attribute. How do you clean up that list? Okay, so you're gonna need to clean up that list. And how do you do that? You start analyzing each one of them. For example, you start looking at what of those could have something in common to maybe clean it up and combine them into one, right? So for example, I have customers right here. So I'm gonna start looking for the rest. And I notice that I have staff, right? So I have staff and customers, both of those refer to people, right? I might have to keep similar information for both of them. Maybe one difference is that they will have different levels of access into different pieces of or parts of the system, right? Staff will be able to maybe look at the orders or add more products, while the customer is only able to look at the products and place orders, right? So I'm going to merge these 2, customers and staff, into one entity that I'm gonna call users, okay? Customer is a user and a staff is a user. And I'm going to add 2 other attributes for roles and permissions. So I'm gonna add a role. There's gonna be a customer role, and there's gonna be a staff role, maybe another admin role, right? And each one of those roles are gonna have a certain set of permissions that determine where they can go and where they can't, okay? So that's one piece of cleanup that I'm gonna do there. Then if I keep going, I'll find, for example, that I have cards and messages, right? So these are things that are only going to exist when an order is a gift, right? So when the order is a gift, I will include a card with a handwritten message, okay? So are those really necessary, or are those part of an order? So that's what we need to decide, right? And this is all your design. Are cards and messages part of an order, or are they an entity on their own, right? So you start thinking, for example, cars. Are there different attributes for a car? Are there different types of cars? There might be, right? You might have like birthday cars or Christmas cars, and maybe later on your client want to add other different type of cars. So you may want to keep that as an entity separately so you can explore it further, right? But with the message is not really an entity because it's not a complex piece of information. I'm not going to have attributes on that message. The message is just a text box, right? A piece of text that I'm going to add to my order. So therefore, a message, even though it's a noun here, is not necessarily an entity, but it's more like an attribute, right? So I believe that I will remove messages, okay? And messages are going to become maybe part of placing an order, like an attribute of placing an order, okay? Let's think, there's other considerations that you can make, right? For example, you can think about addresses, and you can think, the same apply. An address is just a field, right? Like my address. So isn't that kind of like an attribute of users or customers instead of an entity by itself? It might, but then you might remember or consider that a customer may have different addresses, right? So addresses is not unique. You need to remember, or you need to keep in mind that your attributes have to be unique values on your entities. A customer is not necessarily only going to have one address. A customer or a client or a user most likely is going to have several addresses that they want the products delivered to. So we want to keep it as a separate entity. Okay. If we consider those things, we may come up with a cleanup list of entities. I put it over here. So we're going to have users instead. We're going to have roles and permissions. We're going to have orders, order details. We're going to have products, personalizations, packages, payments, cards, delivery options, and addresses. I want you to pay attention to the naming. This is very important depending on which database system you're going to be using, but most of them follow the same formatting. So notice, for example, that the names of my entities are all in lowercase. That's very important. Notice that I don't have a space on the names of my entities, but instead of using underscore to separate those words. So the formatting is different than what we use for regular naming in Java. And it's more of a standard that it's using databases for naming entities, okay? And attributes as well, okay? So we have our entities, that's done. The second part will be the attributes. This one, believe it or not, is a little bit more complex. The other one was only finding names and cleaning up, right? For the attributes, you actually need to know a lot about the system that you're going to create. So this might mean that you're gonna need to go back to your client potentially and ask him like exactly what information do you want for each product? Like how much information do I need to keep for each product? Do you need the color? Do you need the cost? Do you need to have like sizes? Like what information are you gonna keep, right? According to the description that we had before, this was a Google form. So if you look at the Google form, you can see like what are the things that were required in the form, and that's super easy because it helped me identify all of those attributes, right? So it helped me to identify the attributes that I have placed over here. A user will have an email, password, first name, last name, mobile phone. That's all I need, right? But for some other of your systems, maybe they need more information of the users. Maybe we need the age. In this case, we don't need it. Depending on your system, you might need it, right? So you need to find those attributes. And that's a process of discovery and knowing your problem and knowing your situation. The next step will be to determine the primary keys. So like I mentioned before, the primary key is that attribute that is going to identify each one of the records that you add. Like each one of your users has to have a unique ID that will identify it. Why is that? Because we don't want to have repeated information. So if I leave it like this and say I have 2 Meditages that happen to have, or better, let's say that I added a user that is Meditages and I added my email, right? I don't have anything there that is unique to me. So when I go to add another Meditages with the same email, I'm going to create a duplicate version of myself there, and I don't want to have duplicate information on my database, right? So the way to avoid that is to always have a primary key. And that primary key will be that field that, since it's always unique, it's going to help me identify when I have or when I'm attempting to enter repeated information, okay? You can take the attributes that you already consider, like for example, in this case, you can consider, okay, I have email, password, first name, last name, mobile phone. Which one of those could be my primary key? Which one of those is unique? And you can say email. Email is unique, right? Like there's no 2 people with the same email for the most part, right? But emails change, right? So that's maybe not a good idea. There's a standard that is used by many people, and I like it, so I'm going to use it, which is just to create an additional attribute for each one of your tables. As you can see, I did here. For each one of my tables, I've created another attribute that is simply going to be an ID. That's it. So this will be the ID for the user, ID for the roles, ID for the orders. All of them have an ID. And this is simply an auto-incremented numeric value. So the first time that I create a user, that user will be the user 0001, the next one will be 0002, and that's it. I avoid complications that way, okay? So I have a primary key. You need to identify it like you can see that it's done here with the PK over there. And so we have entities, we have attributes, we have primary keys. Now we need to work on relationships, okay? To identify the relationships, and by the way, I probably should stop here. I don't think that any of you are going to need to have something as complex as what I'm trying to put over here. This is a lot of tables. Maybe, hopefully, you're not going to need to have that many tables, okay? So don't get scared. But to identify relationships, you do need to go through a process of thinking, how are my users, for example, related to each one of all of the other tables? You need to go like entity by entity. How is the user related to the role? How is the user related to the permission? How is the user related to an order? Okay. One way to do that, if you wish to, is to create what is called an entity matrix that looks something like this. So you put all of your entities here, all of your entities here, and you start analyzing relationships. Let me make this bigger so you can see it. So for example, I started here, users with users, how are they related? They're not, there's no relationship, so I leave this empty, okay? Then I go, users with roles. A user will have a role. Maybe a user will be a client, right? That would be the connection between roles and users, right? And you keep going, and you can keep finding relationships. For example, users and addresses. What's the relationship? Is there a relationship? Yeah, an address belongs to a user, right? Or a user has an address, whatever you want to call it. But you will immediately identify all of those relationships. And in this case, I have identified 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 relationships between my tables, okay? That's it. I have entities, I have attributes, I have relationships, I have my database basically designed, okay? So I'm gonna move to the step 2. And the step 2, here it is. The step 2 would be to actually go and put this into an entity relationship diagram, create another diagram that represents, that will represent that database that I just designed, okay? So how I'm gonna do that? I'm gonna actually do it here with you guys. There's many tools that you can use to create ERDs. I'm sure that you're expert at finding the perfect tool right now for creating relationships, but I'm gonna use this one over here. We have Lucidchart right into our Google Tools, right? So I'm gonna use Lucidchart here. It's gonna ask me to log in. And here you can create all of the different charts that we have been creating for this part B. And you can also create ERDs. So let me see if I can create just a blank one. Okay, I'm going to use one of those templates. Here's database diagrams, right? So I'm going to click on those ones. You can see that there are many different diagrams for databases. We are going to go with a ERD, simple one. So there's many, these are just like customization of the colors and all of that. I'm going to take this one. I'm just going to clean it up. I'm going to open the template, create my own. Okay, so this one comes with a couple of entities already. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete them. Actually, I'm going to clean this up. Start blank, have a title here, fix that. And it's going to show me by default the options that I have for entity relationship symbols. So as you can see, there's different ways in which you can represent an entity, right? So you can say only the entity and the attributes inside, or you can see entity attributes and that thing on the side is like for special characteristics of the entity. That's the one that I'm going to use. Or you can do it like this, in which you have like the entity name, the characteristic, and the data type, right? Even if you want to have 3 rows. So whatever you prefer, I'm going to use this one. So I'm just going to drag it over here, have my first entity over here. Okay, so I'm going to go over the list of entities that I created. And the first one that I created or that I thought of was the users, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and start editing. This is going to be users, and it's going to have, I said I'm going to create an ID, and it's going to have an email. It's going to have a password. Hopefully you're definitely not going to store that as an empty value. Let's just get a little bit closer here. I'm going to get a little bit closer over here so you can actually see what I'm doing, right? And I want to go ahead and add another one. So let's insert the row. What did I say? A password. Here. Password, and we're gonna have the first name. Remember to use the same conventions that we used. And we're gonna need a last name and a phone number. So last name, and we're gonna need the, okay. So this is, like I said, the characteristic, and they're not all going to be keys for me. Only one of them is gonna be key. What type? There's different types of keys. So I'm gonna get rid of this. It's not true for any of these, right? But for the first one, it is. I said that this is gonna be a key. In particular, this is gonna be my primary key, okay? So I just do that, and with that, I have finished creating my first entity, okay? There you go, I have my entity. I can move it and locate it over here. I'm gonna do the same for all of the other entities. Be right back. Okay, so I have just finished creating all of my entities here with its attributes that I identify and its primary keys. So I think I have them all. We're gonna organize them a little bit better later. So now that we have the entities and its attributes, we need to work on the relationships on our ERD. To build a relationship in our ERD, we first need to try to understand what are the different types of relationships that we can have between entities. So let's go over here. We're going to talk about something that is called the relationship. To be able to discuss the relationships, we're going to talk about relationship cardinality first. And basically this refers to how many are the minimum and the maximum number of instances that can be connected between those two entities that we're related to each other, okay? To determine or to represent those cardinalities, we use different symbols in ERDs, okay? These are the basic ones or the ones that you can use. So you can say that there's a relationship or a maximum or minimum of 1 if you use a connector that has like 1 line across. And you can say that there are many if you use a connector that has 3, like a crow feet thing at the end. You can say that there's a mandatory one, at least 1 for sure, right? Using 2 lines, or mandatory 1 or many, possibility of many with the extra line. You can say that this relationship is optional, so it might be that they are related for some entity, for some records, and for some no, right? We're using the 0 before the 1. Or you can say that it's optional with many, using the 0 before the many symbol, okay? So what does that mean? We went all the way till we identify all of these relationships, right? But basically we need to ask ourselves, how are those relationships going to happen? Okay, each one of those that we identify. So in order to do that, we can ask ourselves a question similar to this one for each of those relationships that we identify over here. So we identify that there's a relationship between users and roles. Let's ask ourselves, what is the minimum and maximum number of users, right? I have here with orders, for example, we identify that a user and orders, what's the relationship here between users and orders? A user can place an order, right? So let's see, let's ask, what is the minimum and maximum number of users that an order can have? So definitely an order can have only 1 and 1 user, that's it. An order belongs only to 1 user. And what is the minimum and maximum number of, you switch the question, you see? What is the minimum and maximum orders that a user can have? So a user can have 0, it's optional, this relationship, or many, okay? So these are how you, this is answering these questions is how you identify the relationship, okay? Depending on what relationship you identify, you may find that you can have 3 different types of relationships that you're gonna find. You may have relationships that are 1 to many, right? Like there's 1 here and many here, like in this case, right? So when you have a relationship that is 1 to many, you're gonna need to use that new concept that I mentioned before. You're gonna need to use a foreign key, okay? So let me explain this. Since I mentioned that a user is going to have potentially 0 or many orders, right? So let's concentrate here on the orders and the users. So we said a user may have 0 or many orders. And then we said also an order is going to belong only to 1 user. And it must have a user. We cannot have an order without a user, right? It's a must, okay? So that relationship, it's a 1 to many relationship, okay? In order to identify like which one goes where, you just need to like answer that question, right? So we said 1 user, mandatory, per order, right? So that means that the symbol for 1 mandatory will go over here. And let me just get that. So we said a user is going to have many orders potentially, right? But an order is only going to have 1 user. So definitely this is the many, this is the 1, which means that on the many table or on the many entity, I'm gonna need to add a new attribute or a new field over here. So I'm going to insert a row below. And this one is also going to be a key, but this time this is gonna be a foreign key. That means that this is a field that already exists as a primary key in another table that is related to this one. So since I want to relate users and orders, I'm going to create a field here that will identify my users. So it's going to be the ID, because that's the primary key on my table users. But since I already have a field that is called ID, I'm going to call this one instead, to make it more clear, I'm going to call this one user ID, right? So my user ID will relate with the ID of my table user to identify which one is the user, the only one user that placed this order, okay? So now to connect them here in Lucidchart is really simple. You don't connect the entities, you connect the actual fields, right? So I want to connect this primary key with this foreign key. So I go ahead and I grab this dot over here, and I actually go ahead and plug it over here on my foreign key, okay? And now you'll see how the connection is made. So here you'll see these options over here to change the endpoint. So in this case, for example, this is a mandatory one, right? And down here, I said I can have, it can be 0, right, orders, or there can be many orders. So I'm going to use the one with the 0 instead, because there can also be 0 orders, right? So I must have one user per order. I can have 0 or many orders per user. Make sense? So that's the way how you define the relationships when they are one-to-many. The other type of relationship that you can find is that you can find relationships that are many-to-many. So many-to-many means that there's, well, like the name says it itself, there's going to be many entities or many records of one entity that relates to many entities of the other, many records of the other entity. Okay, when you have a many-to-many relationship, when you identify a many-to-many relationship, you are going to need to create an additional entity. Okay, so for example, let's look at the relationship that we created between roles and permissions. So we said a role and has a permission, right? And we can say that a role can have many permissions, and a permission can belong to many roles. Like a role can be, for example, an administrator. An administrator can have permission to add and edit products, right? So that's 2 permissions, many permissions. And you can have the permission add can be part of the role of the administrator and also of the simply employee, right? So this is a many-to-many relationship here between permissions and roles, right? So since we have a many-to-many relationship, you cannot do that with just foreign keys. You're going to have to create another entity that is known as an associated entity, okay? And that associated entity is simply going to be an additional table that will hold the primary key of both entities together that relate those 2 attributes together, okay? So how do we do that? For example, let's go with the roles and permissions. Where do I have that? Over here. So with the roles and permissions that I have around here, I have my roles and permissions. I realize that the relationship is many-to-many. So I'm going to create a new entity, okay? That new entity has to be called a combination of both of those entities. So I'm going to call it role permissions, right? And like I said, it's going to have foreign keys, right? It's going to have a foreign key that is going to be the role ID, that refers to this primary key over here. And it's going to have another foreign key that relates to the permissions. So that's going to be the permission ID. Okay, I don't need this one, so I'm going to get rid of this last one over here. There you go. Okay, so this is my new table. And I need a new table because if I have, like I said, a role that relates to one permission for each one of the relationship between role and permission, I'm going to have to create a record here. So I'm going to have that I may have the same role ID several times, several records of the same admin role with the different permissions that the admin has, right? So that's going to create different records here. That's what I did at it. And the relationship between this table and this table is going to be one-to-many. And the relationship between this table and this table is also going to be one-to-many. So since I mentioned that all of our entities need a primary key, I can actually create a combined primary key here. So I can say that both of these, let's make this a little bit wider, that both of these are going to be both foreign keys and also primary keys. I'm going to say this is a primary key and a foreign key, okay? And I'm going to connect them. So I'm going to connect this with my role ID over here. And I'm going to connect this one, oops, this one with my permissions ID over here, okay? There you go. We have a many-to-many relationship, okay? The third type of relationship that we're going to be potentially able to find is a one-to-one relationship. So relationship in which one entity relates to only, or one instance relates to only one instance of the other entity. So for example, we can think about the orders and payments, right? So one order may have only one payment, and the payment will relate to only one order. It's a one-to-one relationship, okay? So how do we represent those? We also use foreign keys. It's very simple. So let's take a look at our orders and payments over here. So we have here orders and we have payments, right? So what I'm gonna do is add that foreign key into my main one in this case. So my main one in this case is the orders table, right? The order is the one that is going to have a payment, right? So I'm gonna go here, and as you can see now, I'm gonna add another foreign key. So that means that an entity can actually have more than one foreign key. So this one is gonna be my payments ID. And I'm gonna create a relationship here then between this one and this one. But this relationship is not gonna be one-to-many, but instead it's gonna be one-to-one. So let's use one-to-one over here, and there we go. We have a relationship done right there, okay? So you're gonna continue adding all of those different relationships between your entities, and you're gonna end up with a entity relationship diagram that will look something like this, right? So entities and their connections between all of those tables or entities, okay? So that will be the second step. I'm gonna stop right there. Like I said, I owe you then steps 3 to 6. We're now, after this, we're gonna go from ERD to SQL or to DMB or to the database management system to create the actual database in code, right? Then we're gonna connect it to our database, our code to our database, and we're going to extract or insert some information into that database using NetBeans on the next video. I hope this was helpful. Take care. Bye-bye.